the audience here. I'm John Harries. I'm Secretary of the Australian Nuclear Association. And if you want to join, you can get on the website and join the Nuclear Association, Australian Nuclear Association. We welcome new members. We're pleased today to be here. Paterson, Dr. A.D. Paterson is going to talk about the future of fusion, the journey to date, and the road ahead, including the Australian proton-boron fusion. Now, most of you know about A.D. So first of all, we have an acknowledgement of country. First of all, we acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people as traditional custodians of this land, and we pay our respect to their elders past and present and future. Now, about A.D. A.D. is a principle of Siava.
Yeah, it's the Zulu word that means we listen.
It's a Zulu word that means we listen. So that's and a non-executive director of HP11 Energy. HP11 Energy is developing laser hydrogen boron 11 fusion to generate electricity using a laser ignited non-thermal fusion. We'll hear a bit more about that later. He was CEO of ANSTO from 2009 to 2020, where he had oversight and responsibility for ANSTO's multifaceted portfolio of activities, including developing formulations with ITER. He's a fellow of the Australian Academy of Technology Societies and Engineering, and an honorary fellow of Engineers Australia, and a fellow of the Academy of Science of South Africa and the South African Academy of Engineering. I'll ask A.D. over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Just checking which time zone we're on, and it's great to be at ANSTO and talking to you today. I'll be working through a version of this talk which covers fusion in a broader outline and then focuses a little bit down on what we are trying to do with HP11. I've got my CEO with me here and one of our senior science people as well, just wave them, Warren. He's the CEO of HP11 Energy, which is a startup here in Australia. And the great news about being a startup in Australia working on fusion is it's a very entrepreneurial space because nobody else in Australia occupies it. In fact, if you look globally, there is a revolution going on in fusion energy, and there are many startups around the world. I'm not going to be saying a lot about those startups today, but the most important thing about fusion startups is they seem to have a decisive and distinctive edge over the national and international programs that you might be familiar with, and which I'll be saying a little bit about today. The other thing that I'd just like to say about being involved in HP11 Energy is we are trying to have a national impact as well, not just on the fact that we want to do fusion, but the fact that Australia is falling behind literally at the speed of light in laser applications because we don't have a petawatt class laser in this country, and I'll say more about that as well. So what do I do here? I just do the page down here, do I? The page down, is that helping? Nope, I click on this button, does that work? Spacebar, acknowledgement of country. In fact, just outside on the wall here is the local acknowledgement of country. I know that ANSTO is in its second innovation phase agenda on working with the local Dharawal people. And this was the wall that we painted a few years ago, and which sits in my memory as a real acknowledgement. And all of these engravings that you see represented visually here are within about 300 meters of where we are. They're Aboriginal engravings on rocks within about, and in fact there are, I think now over 300 within a 5 kilometer radius engravings that have been found. So we're deeply embedded in the history in the fusion game, as well, because in the fusion game, we would not exist without the fusion engine that is the sun. And so fusion is a very important part of our history that has allowed us to be here, but it's also an important part of our future. This is a scale that I drew up when I was talking to government a few years ago about where you had to be in the nuclear equation generally. And this was invented by two of our colleagues, Jason Powell and Kobus Nordia, in 2013, and we took this to the IAEA to explain to them how far Australia was getting. And we sit in the second lowest block, excluded. We're among very few countries, recently been sort of overtaken on the way down to the bottom of this chart by Germany, which is now exiting, which is even worse than being excluded, in my view. And I don't know if you study electricitymap.org, which is one of my favorite sites, but Germany's carbon emissions, usually during the course of a normal working day, are pretty close. They're sort of stuck between South Australia and New South Wales. And that won't change. It'll get worse, but it won't get better. Whereas if you look at a country like France, I think this morning it was 73 grams per kilowatt hour of electricity production, which is around the lowest in the world. I think Norway sometimes as low as 26 with 100% hydro. And so if you're living in the world that I would like to live in, which is a really low carbon world, you should be under 100 grams of carbon of CO2 per kilowatt hour of electricity produced. And really what this scale says is that part of that future is fusion. Unfortunately, in the Australian setting, and I'm a bit of an activist in this regard because no one's paying me to be involved in nuclear energy, is to really ask the question, are we on the right track? In fact, our Prime Minister announced yesterday that we're on the same track as Germany. So you know where the Prime Minister stands on that. I would stand closer to Paris in order to be on the right side of that equation, or Oslo. But it's not a political meeting, so we will not pursue that debate. But look at the world energy consumption. And just to show you that we've got a bit of work to do, this is world energy consumption. This is 2021. You can see electricity up at the top there is the yellow, biofuels and waste, natural gas, oil, and coal. So if we think that electricity is the way to zero carbon, that wouldn't be right. Okay, a lot of what we do with transport fuels, for example, or process heat for industry does not come from electrons. And so the journey to decarbonization is the journey actually not just to electrons, but it's a journey to electrons plus process heat. And one of the great benefits of fusion as a high temperature, both input and output, is that the top end of process heat is just amazing. I mean, just about everything we'd ever want to make in industry with reasonable scale fusion reactors would become plausible and possible in a fusion world. So we underestimate the need for process heat dramatically. And I just want to point that out to you for those of you who think that electricity is the fight, actually the fight for industrial economies. And I think we are probably a post-industrial economy with the exception of 4 remaining aluminium plants, all of which will probably switch off in the next 20 years. On the current trajectory, will be a genuinely post-industrial society, and we will be a resource extractive society seeking to be a low carbon society. So if we look at the Australian energy sources, and this is all of this data is from the International Energy Agency, and if you don't spend, as I have, weeks on the International Energy Agency site, looking at different countries, looking at their different strategies, they've got the most amazing data. And in fact, you can look at all of this data, how it changes from about 1984. They've got all of it in sequential Sankey diagrams and other things. But the reality check is that over the period of time that we're talking up to 2020, that little, what I call the thin green line, is wind and solar in Australia, relative to our energy sources. Okay, so do not be deceived. Anything that anybody says to you about wind turbines and solar panels solving the problem of carbon in Australia is deeply misinformed. And that's not the journey that is going to get us anywhere close to where we need to be. I mean, we got a massive issue just with transport fuels, for example, which is where you see the oil and so on. So I don't want to depress you. I just want to challenge you to be an articulate discussant of energy and our energy future as we think about fusion as a possible source. So fusion, the next generation. So everybody makes jokes about fusion. It's always going to take 30 years. I don't know why we use 30 years, because 30 years is, the average human lifetime now is going to be about 100 years, we think. I think the average person in a well-developed country is expected now to live, is it 92 years? I think women live a little bit longer than men still. So we used to say 30 because that was in the Vietnam War when we didn't think we were going to survive, right? So that sort of hung on. But that war is kind of over. We're now living in a world where the average age in developed nations is probably above 90. And in the emerging economies, of course, massive challenges. And if we think that we just got to solve the problem of the world we're living in, it's a bit of a challenge. But if you look at the two big games in town around fusion energy, and I'm going to take two examples today. The one is ITER, the famous project in Cadarache in France. Australia is linked to that program through ANSTO, which maintains a relationship. Australia was the first non-ITER country to join ITER as an associate member. Did you know that? It's exciting, isn't it? All right, and we went and beat down the doors. Our colleagues with us at ANU, who were very well connected, they had a Stellarator at ANU at the time. They had a wonderful theoretical group. Matthew Hulse is still there and still links back to the International Atomic Energy Agency for us. We had a global position in the discussions about fusion, but we weren't an ITER member. And that allowed us to join the ITER program. And the other one, the entrepreneurial one, is HP11 Energy, which I'll also say more about. But ITER is joined at the hip to deuterium-tritium fusion, where you take deuterium, which there's quite a lot of it about. We'll never run out of deuterium. I think it's one in every 1,756 atoms of hydrogen is a deuterium atom, and there's much less tritium, so we have to make our tritium. So tritium is created in the top of the atmosphere by cosmic ray, interaction with the top of the atmosphere on a regular basis. Some of it falls into the sea. There's strong opposition to the Japanese putting some tritium into the sea, which comes out of the Fukushima reactor. That is largely emotional hype because there is tritium in the sea already. There's a very small amount, and there's nothing to panic about. But deuterium and tritium, when you smash them together, when you fuse them, they release a neutron. And they pump out a bunch of energy, and they make this amazing thing called helium. And helium is an incredible part of the universe, because if you put three heliums together, you essentially get carbon-12, and that's what happens in the sun. Is as the sun gets hotter and hotter, it goes straight from helium to carbon-12. Everything in between is cosmogenic and actually happens outside of what happens in the sun. with cosmic rays. And so things like boron, for example, are really generated by cosmogenesis. They're not generated by heliogenesis. And so helium, is an important part of the puzzle as a very, very stable way to go. Now, the 5 seconds of positive energy production in 2022. Those of us who love fusion, we're running around. We celebrated for weeks after this. This was the Joint European Torus in the UK, which is kind of a baby ITER. And with the combination of magnetic confinement, a big magnetic bottle, and high temperature, they were able to get 5 seconds of positive energy generation. Anybody see what happened in the States recently when they pointed all of those lasers? Probably the most expensive way to get net production of energy ever tried. I mean, just to summarize that experiment that happened is they basically at the facility where they've got all of these lasers near Chicago, they basically stole electricity from Chicago. I think it was 15 minutes of Chicago electricity. And they pumped up a whole lot of capacitors and fed that into all of these lasers pointing at this tiny little thing that cost $1.5 million. And they had net production of energy. It was exciting. I celebrated for 2 days. Point the microphone at me. Is that better? All right. So we've made progress with fusion. In the old DT environment, we are showing that you can do it. And with lasers pumping into very small amounts of materials, we are showing that you can do it. Why is this so important? It's because in the journey of humanity, the journey of energy density to produce electrons is the journey that has been the most successful journey. If we can produce electrons, we can deal with one aspect of human society's flourishing and the ability of human society to be taken seriously as an actor on a planet that is severely stressed from our own impact on it. But to come back to ITER, and both a positive and a worry, this ITER is the most amazing place. I've been there a few times. This is a photograph that I took actually during the fabrication phase when they were joining the first segment of the torus. This is massive. I don't think we can actually see any people in these diagrams, but these walkways where you can see the barriers and the barriers up at the top are essentially, to keep humans from falling off this thing. So you can imagine the size of this segment and its weight, and there are 8 of those segments. Now, what you need to know about ITER is that those segments have been fabricated in different countries. Not everybody has made the torus. So they've all been fabricated along an engineering baseline, which is in a large number of different countries. And just to do the fitting before they get to the final fitting, the kind of resolution, the kind of engineering precision that had to be achieved was less than 0.3 of a millimeter on that entire shape and on every important dimension before they kind of couple it together and bash it a bit. And anyway, one of them got dropped at a certain point, and they were able to kind of undo the little bit of a distortion that achieved from being dropped off a crane at ITER. There's about 30,000 kilometers of a particular cable that has already been installed, which is one of the important electrical connection devices in ITER. And the most recent sad news about ITER is that that 30,000 kilometers of cabling is defective. And I just worry whether they can recover from this sort of problem. I've been a passionate supporter of ITER. But one of the challenges of being ITER and having these different countries doing different things and having a quality control system that you're working across all of these countries is it might be that the 30-year estimate is an underestimate for ITER. It could be between anything and 30 years and infinity. So much as I love the ITER experiment, and you probably shouldn't report this too widely because I don't think it's widely published, although you can find it if you look on the right websites, I think that ITER is in trouble. And that's why, in a way, for magnetic confinement, the national programs and the emerging startups that are doing magnetic confinement are actually more interesting, and going straight to superconducting cables and so on is probably interesting. So this could be an iconic photograph taken by a partner visitor from Australia at a particular point, captures a moment of enthusiasm before, again, the journey of fusion losing hope again. Yet I remain hopeful. Why do I remain hopeful? Well, two people, Basil Schonland and Heinrich Hauser, Heinrich Hora are a great individual who has championed this technology for years. In fact, Heinz found me about 2 weeks after I arrived at ANSTO, and came in and gave me a copy of his book, and came into the little cubbyhole office at the back of my office in ANSTO, and where I was storing all the most important books, and I put it on the shelf with all of the key books that I was going to pay attention to, and to read the history of his engagement with this, right back from the days after the Second World War, where some of these ideas first came together. It just reminded me that Australia's first demonstration of fusion, way back in the 1930s, to where we are now, is dependent on individuals, people who have had a passion and a commitment that far exceeds the sort of simplistic view of this 30-year journey. In fact, the Australian journey to fusion is the longest single country journey to fusion of any other country in the world. We hold a unique place in fusion, and we should continue to hold a unique place in fusion, because the minds of people like these two on the screen are so powerful and so insightful into the future that the trivialization of this as just dealing with carbon in a trivial way is not right. And so you've got Rutherford and Oliphant involved in that process. The other person who has recently been very involved in this is Dr. Warren McKenzie, here present. And he has been working out of HP11 to pull together a consortium of Australian organizations, and the people who are involved in those organizations are shown on the screen, but you can see it's everybody from ANSTO, University of Sydney, Griffith, Macquarie. We've got people from the defense community and others who've participated in this process of putting together a white paper for a petawatt laser research infrastructure in Australia. Now, why would we do that? The reason that we would do that is because in order to get the fusion reaction to take place, not in a tokamak, but in a different configuration, we need to make our confinement vessel with laser beams. And by using the laser as the initiator of the reaction and getting the benefit of using some of that energy to fire the lasers, so you can imagine that's one loop. I'm firing the laser, I get out some energy to fire the laser again. That's the kind of internal energy loop. The balance of the energy that's produced in the fusion reaction can then be used for process heat if the temperature is high enough. And then at the level at which you can make electrons efficiently, you can make electrons. And so the journey to laser inertial confinement of the fusion reaction is the possibility that by being able to power the lasers, rather than have a big magnetic bottle as we have in the tokamaks, is we get a different pathway to fusion. that make sense? So we've got the ITER tradition, and we've got the HP11 energy passion, if you will. It's not a tradition yet, because we're still waiting for the laser that can do the job. All right, which is why there's a white paper for petawatt lasers in Australia. Now, why is there a white paper for petawatt lasers in Australia? Does anybody see Australia on that map? You can just see the top end. Okay. They didn't put the top end because that's where we have our laser facility. They put the top end because that's where they were cutting off the map. Right. There is not a petawatt class laser in Australia. There's not even a shadow of close to a petawatt class laser in Australia. And yet these are the ultra high intensity petawatt laser facilities all around the world. And we don't even have one of those. So I hope that you will now sign up at the door. Warren will meet you if you haven't already. Talk to your friends in universities. Be encouraged if you're online as well to get in touch with the people who were on the previous page, and put your shoulder to the wheel with your local politician and write to the minister, Ed Husick, among others, and say, we need that laser. We need the petawatt laser capability in this country for many reasons. Most of these facilities are not interested in energy. They're doing all sorts of wonderful experiments. They're doing new science. And if we can get, I'm hoping we could get into a 10 petawatt class laser here. Maybe we'll have to start a little bit smaller, a little bit less ambitious. But if we got one of the best petawatt class lasers facilities in the world, we could do a whole lot of new science, which would build a generation of scientists who today would have to do suitcase science like we used to do with the synchrotron before we had a synchrotron. But we don't even have a suitcase science laser programmer, as far as I know, in Australia at the moment. And so we are literally falling behind the laser world at the speed of light. Just a joke. However, we do have in ANSTO the biggest connection to global players who can help us with the journey towards fusion energy in all sorts of ways. And the reason I put this one up is, in a way, one of the nodes of thinking about the future of energy in Australia, given that we've got this unique position of being completely disconnected from the reality of the whole of the atomic-related world, is ANSTO uniquely has a set of connections that I think are remarkable and which would be a good template. And if you added to those the connections that could come with a laser overlay, that would be a powerful thing. I also think that South Australia has got some unique laser capabilities. And I think there's a strong possibility that we could put a laser facility in South Australia and build a petawatt class laser there, because they've certainly got people who can build lasers and build laser facilities and so on. But the ambition should be for ANSTO, in the same generous spirit that we helped Victoria to get the Australian synchrotron, to build that laser capability, which is going to be so important to the future. But let me talk about HP11 and fusion. So our reaction is a little bit different, because we take this curious isotope, boron-11. And by the way, there's a separate talk, and you can find me afterwards, all about why boron is so interesting, boron-10 and boron-11. If you boron-10 and boron-11, you just literally don't feel like you live in the same element at all. But that's another story for another day. But boron-10 and boron-11 are really interesting, because boron-10 is a neutron absorber. It's used in nuclear power reactors to stop the reaction. So you've got boron-10 rods that are inserted into nuclear reactors to reduce the number of neutrons in the control reaction. Boron-11 is the opposite. It's kind of incredibly neutron rich. So when you smack it with a proton, and it bumps into another bunch of energy on the way out, it turns into 3 heliums. Again, what are 3 heliums? carbon-12. All right. So this is on the journey from helium in the sun to carbon-12 in the sun. Boron might be an intermediary. We don't know enough about that. But cosmogenically, all of the helium that's cosmogenic is produced in this reaction, probably. And so you get helium that's cosmogenic in the universe and helium that is generated in stellar reactions as well. There's plenty of boron. It is easy to separate and to purify. And it is a remarkable element from the point of view that because there's a lot of it about, it turns out, by the way, it's also essential to plant life. Very small amounts of boron seem to make plants viable. So again, it's anyway, this is not about boron, this is about fusion energy. But boron in this configuration and splitting into this environment just gives out a massive amount of energy. And that fusion energy is the basis of what we are doing at HP11. So I'm not going to give a strong science lecture today because I know that this is a generalized audience. But this is the mission that HP11 set itself a few years ago, was to work on these 6 questions which underpinned our journey to unpacking what we needed to do. The first thing was to see if we could get this phenomenon of block ignition to be better understood and to start to have some real engineering insight and capability doing, so that you could use the laser radiation pressure a little bit like a confinement vessel, but a confinement vessel that would actually cause the reaction to propagate in a very powerful way. The other thing that is interesting for us, and which again some progress has been made, is that if the laser configuration that you put together can also make a bit of a magnetic bottle, given the magnetic properties that exist in that particular plasma, can you get some magnetic confinement locally into that reaction? In other words, like having a mini ITER at that we're doing. So those were 2 big science questions. I can say that one of the fabulous things of being part of this team and working with groups across the world is that a lot of progress has been made in the science. And part of being in a startup that is making fundamental contributions to the science is very, very powerful. We then wanted to look at what sort of lasers we would need. And this led to the idea of the petawatt laser. And then we wanted to think, how would you make a practical reactor? How would you make fuel? And put that all into what today we're thinking of as a digital clone of what an ultimate fusion reactor will look like. And so being able to run it in silicon at the same time as you're developing the science in the science space, and ultimately you're starting to put it together in the engineering space, those 3 things together constitute the HP11 fusion journey. Now, we are not alone. There are other people who are in this game as well, and they're also on this journey. But the unique thing is that there is no national program on scale that is independently trying to do what we're trying to do. There are startups around the world. There are a couple of places where it looks like a national program may emerge. But this is literally the late starter, but fast out of the blocks part of the fusion equation. And I won't go through the science in detail. It's all on our website. But I do want to come to this remarkable pair of people. I won't call them a couple because they are not. This is Donna Strickland and Gerard Moreau, who won the Nobel Prize in 1985 for being able to take a conventional laser light and squash it into a very small packet of energy. She, at the time that she did the work that got her the Nobel Prize, had not completed her PhD. So anybody busy with a PhD here? No, yeah, one person's busy with a PhD. Keep working, right? You might have it, right? I just find this absolutely remarkable that somebody doing this work, and knowing both having been a student and a supervisor, I suspect she was doing all the heavy lifting in this particular equation, and did this remarkable piece of work. And this is actually from the Nobel Prize lecture. This is the picture they used in the Nobel Prize lecture to show what they did. And if any of you are aspiring to get a Nobel Prize anytime soon, I would recommend that you use a graphic of at least this quality, because I think it's rather good, because it shows how you just take a laser light, you pack it into a very small pulse, and you pack it in, and eventually it comes out as this, this highly compressed amount of energy. So, for example, to get the sort of energies that we would want to do, you really have to take a vast amount of the energy that is produced in a place like New South Wales for a number of minutes in order to get the laser pulses that will fire the type of petawatt laser that we need. But because you pack it into a very short pulse, it works rather well. So the journey is not a simple one. This is another version which just makes it a little bit easier to understand. So what are the synergies? We've got a 10 petawatt class laser ambition. We know that repetition rates of less than 1 shot per minute have been achieved. We've got all of this joining together in a way that we might be able to make a big contribution. So I want to stop there for a moment and say, what do we have to really do to get this to work economically? How do you make a power plant that actually can do fusion? And I want to point out that there is publicly available academic research which clearly defines the journey that we're on. This is not something we're making up in a small room. And this work on fusion economics, which was done in Japan by Takeda and his colleagues, is a very useful piece of work because it shows that the particular type of configuration that the HP11 type of power plant will be uniquely capable of working in a world which has got a non-traditional grid, where you have got different amounts of energy at different times, and that's pretty useful. It's heavy going, by the way, that paper, so I just leave it here so that you feel comfortable rather than you rush off unless you're very excited about this type of stuff and read the paper. But there's also work that has been done from a scenario perspective. And I'm just going to read this phrase out of the paper. Competition through the private sector would bring a welcomed alternative to the slow multinational publicly funded path towards fusion, which could possibly accelerate the timeline. There are still many technical hurdles to address to make fusion feasible and economically competitive with other technologies. But fusion appears to have a bright future ahead. 2017, this is the future of low carbon energy. So the academic consensus, I think, is converging towards what we're talking about here as an important focus for the future. Fusion is not just 30 years away and then still 30 years away and 30 years away. In really good economic studies and really good scenario studies, fusion has already demonstrated, independently of the work that we're doing in HP11 energy, independently of the work that has been done at ITER and which may not be successful, independently of any ambitions, there are people looking at fusion through the lens of the future, through the lens of economics, and saying, we need fusion. So I really urge at this point in the talk, what about this fuel? What about this fuel? Why shouldn't we be looking at it? Why shouldn't we be making that digital clone? We're going to need this fuel. From 2035, inertial fusion is going to be absolutely essential to our future. Motsan, by the way, is one of my mottos. I think some people from ANSTO may remember it. It means more of the same is not enough. More of the same is not enough. So, simply put, let's get the laser. We've got the program for putting it together, and that'll be the basis of our best energy journey. Thank you very much.
That's good. Yeah, all right. Any questions? So I think we only have one microphone here, so I might have to repeat. If you're going to have a long question, you might need to come here, and we've got to watch the my screen as well. Any questions in the room?
How does like the fusion energy like stack up against small modular reactors and that kind of pathway? That seems like
Yeah. Can you just repeat the question?
Yep. So how does fusion stack up against the conventional nuclear small modular reactors and so on that are coming forward? So the energy density of fusion is higher. So your upside on the bits that aren't electricity is better. I see small modular reactors as transitional from the current energy system. And really important, for example, in the Australian setting, where nuclear energy is unbanned. I mean, it's irrational to be one of the 2 countries in the world that is banning nuclear energy. One which has given it up and has banned it, and the other one which has still banned it. But small modular reactors have the benefit that, in principle, you get the benefits of making them at factory scale, replicatable, reduce the cost that way. And they've got conventional and better fuels, accident-tolerant fuels that make them very, very attractive in the short term. In fact, if we started a really classy small modular reactor program in Australia today, with some of the ones that are rolling off the line now, we could be early 2030s. We could have small modular reactors in Australia. But you've got to have ambition, and you've got to have a sense that dilute renewables are a path to becoming a wine farm and a tourist destination, which is a fair description of everywhere except Tasmania, which is a wine farm and a tourist destination, but has hydro. And this morning, the electricity cost 2 cents in Tasmania and 49 cents in South Australia. So I'd go for Tasmania any day. Energy density wins. So I think that fusion has got the capability, because of the higher thermal capability. If you take our reactor, for example, the top end of the energy that is not used for the laser, all of the energy that would normally be used for house loads and other things in a conventional fission reactor, that 40%, 39 to 40%, that would all be ours for process heat and electrons. The rest just comes from the efficiency of the lasers. And if we can get that feedback, everything else is as good as just having a power source that is as good as any nuclear reactor, but you don't have to worry about getting the fuel. That's pretty cool. Yeah.
In all these fusion reactors, how do they actually transfer the heat to be usable for heating for something?
Yeah.
Generating steam to electricity.
It's a great question. So in a fusion reactor, how do you take the heat and convert it into the useful energy, either steam or by some other mechanism? So this is a really interesting area. So the conventional thing to do would be to do something like steam. Steam sort of tops out 360, that sort of area. If you go back to the old UK reactor tradition, they had medium temperature gas reactors. They had really great process heat on the top of that. So the higher your delta T in a conventional reactor, the more top end you've got and the better things you can do with the heat. In the case of fusion, one of the sort of holy grails of HP11 fusion is you will notice that the heliums that come off are positively charged. So there is some potential for direct charge transfer, where you take the positive charge of the helium and you touch the wall of the reactor and you have an electron on the other side as you neutralize it. And you just steal those electrons. I have oversimplified. But in principle, you're producing positive charges out of this reaction. I see some of the engineers think this is amusing, but I think it's at least plausible that there is a net positive charge production in that reaction. So if you take direct charge transfer plus helium as the product in the fusion reaction, because helium is the product, you can put it straight into a helium turbine. This is PBMR technology, pebble bed modular reactor technology that I was developing years ago back in South Africa. And if you've got a direct loop that's using the helium into a turbine, your effective operating temperature can be as high as 960 degrees. That gives you a huge amount of electrons, and it gives you a great outcome. So no matter how you do the thermal transfer, the trick is to know how to manage the top end. We know how to manage up to about 860. From 860 to 1300, it's new technology. The effective top operating technology at the moment is about 1260, but the engineering is expensive. So the second half of the century will be learning how to work with process fluids above about 860 till about 1260 degrees. And that's going to be a lot of fun. Please sign up now for the PhD. But I think all of those things are plausible. I mean, we know how to do high temperature helium turbines up to 860. That design engineering is mature. Yep.
Other than HP11, which companies are the ones to watch for the earliest commercialization? In fact, are there any, I suppose?
Yeah. Anything that's got the initials MIT involved in it would have my attention. I've got great respect for MIT, except for a very small subset of their people who are confused about electrons. By the way, the best work on the future of electricity grids is done by an MIT PhD student called Sepulveda, Sepulveda. Look him up, get his thesis. He has proved that you have to have low carbon electrons in the grid, preferably nuclear, in order to run a grid. I think that is absolutely demonstrated. But MIT has got some good stuff. I think on the West Coast, there are a couple of people who have done very good engineering development, multiple machine development. I can't remember the name of that one at the moment, but if you look at the sort of the fusion sites, anybody who's built a lot of machines in order to understand what is happening in machines at different scales has got my respect, because engineering pays off in the end. So without naming too many names, I would say look for good engineering routes and look for good schools in the US sense of schools that are underpinning it. And then secondly, see how many rounds they get through. I mean, you know, part of my excitement being involved in HP11 energy is that we have got our feet on the engineering ground and we've got the ambition in relation to the energy outcome. And that's characterized, Heinz Horer's work right through. Is he was waiting for the laser, and when the laser came, he knew that the laser was going to do a bunch of the heavy lifting. I think that the challenge for many of the fusion companies is that if they are not advancing the engineering, they are probably still advancing the science. We've had this balance, as I say. Our current phase of the company had these science questions that had to be answered. I mean, it's a wonderful website. We're going to replace it soon with a new one because we're moving into the next phase. But I think the vision of get your core science statements correct and then move on to the engineering is important. So I would not specifically call out any of them. What you don't want to do is to be caught in the wrong sort of hype cycle. I mean, there's some necessary hype cycle in this, but fundamentally, you want to be connected to reality. It's so much fun to be on the innovation site at Nandon here. We've got a little office there. We up here 4 days a week. Yeah. Another question.
usual question. How many failed experiments have HP11 got on the shelf?
So we've got, yeah, how many failed experiments does HP11 have on the shelf? We've got a track record of working with some of the best teams in the world around the laser side of this equation. At the moment, I would say every single experiment has been high utility. Some have had better than expected outcomes. Some have had new physics outcomes, I think it would be fair to say. And so we've had a couple where we expected to get 3 shots in a laser facility and we managed to get 1. That would be a failure. That makes you grumpy. You know, but I think, you know, the remarkable thing about this is because we are working with some of the best people in the world as partners and collaborators, and because we are still in a science translation phase, failure normally means that something goes wrong in the facility or a target falls out before the beam hits it or some of the diagnostics don't work or something like that. Oh yeah. So what do you learn from failure? One of the key things that we learn from failure is communicate. So it's amazing to be involved in our science meetings, for example, to find out how that science community can find each other in the dark. And then laser's all about putting the light into that. I'm really optimistic. I've been involved in many consortium-based science developments that have led to outcomes. This is in a class of its own. I mean, the ability to convene top laser people from all over the world and to get them to stick with this program for a significant period of time and to meet between every 7 to 14 days over periods of years. There's nothing wrong with the brain power and the convening power of HP11 compared to our peers, in my humble opinion. And we've done that spending incremental dollars rather than big bucks. However, if you are a high net worth investor and you want to talk to us afterwards, we are very happy to talk. Yeah. Well, let's take one more and then I'm
one more question. What's the last question?
My question is just about like what kind of pathways are there in Australia for education in this kind of space?
Yeah. So I think there is a growing number of stuff going. So depending which side you're on, if you're on the laser side, I think there are going to be big new laser programs. Yeah. So being asked about educational opportunities in the general field of fusion plus lasers. Is that a fair question? It was a very fair question. Is that a fair summary of the question? And I'll point out to a couple of people to speak to afterwards as well. I think the trick is to get this national laser facility up. It has convening power. You know, we spent years trying to get a synchrotron. When we finally got it, we then had to go back to the government and ask for extra money. But once we had it going and we asked for the extra money, it's mainstream and it's generating hundreds of publications a year and so on. The vision for the laser facility is that every question, every underfunded program and so on would grow. At the moment, by the way, just in case you're calling your MP, we are at the lowest level of funding as a aspirational developed country relative to our peers than we have ever been in the last 40 years. We have fallen off a science cliff, all right? This is a national embarrassment. It's probably on the same scale as our electrical strategy in terms of being embarrassing. Those two together need to be addressed by the young people in this room and the older people who've still got the ambition to do the occasional leaning against a fence. It is not good, the situation we're in at the moment. But let me finish on an optimistic note. It is when you realize how bad it can get when you don't have enough money in your science system that the ambition to fix it can actually take us onto a new trajectory. It's when you have the ambition to use dilute resources like wind and sunlight to be the basis of your electricity future that you might actually go for the type of light that I've been talking about. Thank you.
Well, so thank you, Adi, for a very comprehensive talk. And I guess you end up on a quite positive note for HB11 and the possible future. I mean, fusion still has a way to go, but it's great to see all this, I guess, science building up and building some momentum behind it. So thank you, and thank you all for coming in.
Thank you.
Good.